The waiting room of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital smelled like antiseptic and desperation. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale, sickly glow across rows of plastic chairs bolted to the floor. A child cried somewhere near the vending machines. A television mounted high on the wall played the evening news with the volume turned too low to hear. In chair 47, pressed against the wall beneath a poster about hand washing, sat Walter Green. 87 years old, 5'8", 143 pounds, most of it memory and regret. His hands, calloused and spotted with age, gripped the armrests of a chair. His breathing came in short, shallow pulls, each one a little harder than the last. What does it mean to wait in silence while carrying the weight of a lifetime? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like Walter's should never be forgotten. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, sacrifice, and the heroes who never asked for recognition. Their stories deserve to be told. And we're just getting started. The pain in his chest had started 3 hours ago. A dull ache at first, easy to ignore. He'd been pruning the roses in his backyard when it began, a tightness that spread from the center of his sternum outward like cracks in old glass. He'd sat down on the porch steps. He'd waited. He thought it would pass. He didn't pass. That'd be why the time he'd driven himself to the hospital. The pain had become something else entirely. A crushing weight, like someone had placed an anvil on his ribs. His left arm tingled. His vision blurred at the edges. He knew what this was. He'd seen it before. 50 years in the field, you learn to recognize the signs. But he didn't say anything. He checked in at the front desk. He filled out the forms with a shaking hand. And when the triage nurse asked him to rate his pain on a scale of 1 to 10, he said, maybe a 4. Because that's what you did. You didn't make a fuss. You didn't draw attention. You waited your turn. The nurse, a young woman with tired eyes and a badge that read Melissa, barely looked at him. She took his blood pressure. Normal enough. Pulse slightly elevated, but he was old. Old people had elevated pulses. She typed something into the computer and told him to take a seat. Someone will call you shortly, she said, already looking past him to the next person in line. Walter nodded. He shuffled to chair 47. He sat down, and he waited. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if you believe that the stories of true heroes should never be forgotten, subscribe to our channel. Because some stories deserve to be told. Around him, the emergency room moved with the controlled chaos of a Saturday night. A teenager with a skateboard injury was wheeled past, laughing with his friends. A woman in business attire argued with the insurance coordinator about coverage. An ambulance crew brought in a man on a stretcher, shouting medical codes that sent nurses running. Walter watched it all through a haze of pain. He focused on his breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow, steady, the way Sergeant Mills had taught him in 1962. Control your breath, you control your fear. Control your fear, you control the situation. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. The pain in his chest tightened like a vice. Sweat soaked through his shirt, darkening the fabric under his arms and across his back. He wanted to stand, to walk to the desk, to say something. But the waiting room was full. There were people bleeding, people crying, people who needed help more than he did. At least. That's what he told himself, the 2-hour mark. Walter's vision began to narrow. The edges of the room grew dark, closing in like a tunnel. His hands felt cold, numb. He looked down at them. These hands that had once moved with such certainty, such purpose. Now they trembled against the armrests, pale and weak. That he thought about his wife, Sarah, gone 7 years now. He thought about his daughter, living 3 states away, too busy with her own life to call more than once a month. He thought about the roses in his backyard, half pruned, waiting for him to come home and finish the job. He thought about a lot of things. But mostly, he thought about a night 50 years ago, when the world had been on fire and he'd been the only one who could stop it. Doctor Marcus Chun stood at the nurse's station, reviewing a chart on his tablet. 11 years as an ER surgeon. 11 years of gunshot wounds, car crashes, overdoses, and every variation of human fragility the city could produce. He was good at his job, fast, efficient, He didn't get emotional. Emotion slowed you down, and in the ER, speed was the difference between life and death. Dr. Chun, the intake coordinator, a middle-aged man named Robert, waved him over. "You got a second?" Marcus didn't look up from his tablet. "What is it?" Old guy in chair 47. "Been here over 2 hours. Says his chest hurts, but vitals are stable. Probably just anxiety. But he looks, I don't know, off." Marcus sighed. His shift was ending in 20 minutes. He had real emergencies to handle. A motor vehicle accident in Bay 3. A possible stroke in Bay 7. He didn't have time for off. But something in Robert's voice made him pause. Robert had been doing this job for 15 years. He knew the difference between anxiety and something worse. "Fine," Marcus said, setting down his tablet. "Let me take a look." He walked across the waiting room, weaving between chairs and tired families. Chair 47 was in the corner, partially hidden by a support column. The man sitting there looked small, frail. His skin had a grayish pallor that Marcus recognized immediately. "Sir," Marcus knelt down in front of him, bringing himself to eye level. "I'm Dr. Chun. I hear you're not feeling well." Walter's eyes focused slowly, like a camera lens adjusting. "I'm okay," he whispered. "Just waiting my turn." Marcus reached for his wrist, checking his pulse manually. "Thready. Weak. Too fast. How long have you been feeling this pain?" "Not long." "Sir, I need you to be honest with me." "How long?" Walter hesitated. 3 hours. Maybe 4. Marcus's jaw tightened. 3 to 4 hours of chest pain, and he'd been sitting here the whole time. "Why didn't you say something?" "You were busy." Those 3 words hit Marcus harder than he expected. "You were busy." How many times had people suffered in silence because they thought someone else's emergency was more important? How many Walters had sat in this waiting room? Too polite to interrupt, too conditioned to wait their turn. "I'm going to examine you," Marcus said, his voice firm now. "Can you lift your arms for me?" Walter tried. His right arm rose halfway. His left barely moved at all. Marcus reached for the zipper of Walter's jacket, pulling it down. He lifted the thin cotton shirt underneath, exposing the old man's chest. And that's when he saw it. The scarred IT ran from just below Walter's left clavicle down to his lower ribs. A thick, jagged line of tissue, pale against the weathered skin. But it wasn't the scar itself that made Marcus freeze. It was the shape, the specific pattern of the tissue, the way it curved and branched like a map of something terrible. Marcus had seen scars like this exactly once before, in a medical textbook, in a chapter he'd never thought he'd need outside of historical reference. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, his hand still resting on Walter's chest. "Where did you get this scar?" Walter's eyes met his. For the first time since he'd sat down, there was something other than pain in them. Something old, something distant. "Vietnam," he whispered. 1971. Marcus's blood ran cold. "What happened?" Walter's breath hitched. There was a school. 317 children. A bomb. Someone had to, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. Marcus stood so fast his knees cracked. He turned to the nurse's station, and his voice, usually so controlled, came out sharp and commanding. "I need a crash cart to chair 47. Now, I need a gurney. I need an EKG, full labs, and someone call cardiology. Tell them we have a STEMI, and I need them here 5 minutes ago." The waiting room went silent. Every head turned. Nurses moved with sudden, urgent purpose. Robert ran over with the gurney. "What is it? What's wrong?" Marcus didn't answer. He was already helping Walter onto the stretcher, his hands gentle but fast. "Sir, I need you to stay with me. We're going to take care of you. Do you understand? You're going to be fine." Walter nodded weakly. As they wheeled him toward the trauma bay, Marcus kept one hand on his shoulder. "And he didn't let go, Dot. If you believe that heroes should never have to wait, type 'never forgotten' in the comments below." Inside Trauma Bay 1, the chaos was controlled but intense. Nurses swarmed around Walter, attaching monitors, inserting IVs, cutting away his jacket and shirt. The EKG machine beeped steadily, then frantically. The line on the screen showed what Marcus already knew: acute myocardial infarction. Heart attack. Massive. And they were running out of time. "Gimme cardiology," Marcus barked. "And someone page Dr. Patterson. I don't care if he's in surgery. Get him out." A young resident, barely out of med school, leaned over to Marcus. "Sir, do we know anything about this patient? Medical history? Family?" Marcus looked down at Walter. The old man's eyes were closed now, his breathing shallow. His chest rose and fell in weak, irregular movements. "His name is Walter Green," Marcus said quietly. "And he's a hero." The resident blinked. "Sir," Marcus didn't explain. There wasn't time. But as he worked, as he pushed medications and monitored vitals and fought to keep this man alive, his mind kept returning to that scar, to the shape of it, to what it meant that he'd read about it once. A case study from the 1970s. A field medic in Vietnam who had manually disarmed a bomb inside a school. The device had been rigged to a pressure plate beneath the floor. If anyone moved, it would detonate. If they evacuated, the bomber would detonate it remotely. The medic had crawled underneath. He'd spent 4 hours in a crawl space 18 inches high, with 300 children sitting above him, disarming a device he'd never been trained to handle. When the bomb's fail-safe triggered, it had torn through his chest. The shrapnel had missed his heart by millimeters that he'd survived. Barely. And he'd saved every single child. The case study had been titled, "Improvised Heroism in Asymmetric Warfare." Marcus had never thought he'd meet the man from that study. He'd never thought that man would nearly die in his waiting room because he was too polite to ask for help. Vitals are dropping. A nurse called out. BP 80/40. Heart rate 140. "Push another round of AP," Marcus ordered. "And give me that damn cardiologist." The door burst open. Dr. Raymond Patterson, head of cardiology, strode in with the air of a man used to being called for emergencies. He was 63, silver-haired, with a reputation for being brilliant and abrasive in equal measure. "What V we got?" he demanded. 87-year-old male. STEMI. 3 to 4 hours of chest pain before he was seen. Patterson's face darkened. 3 to 4 hours? Why the hell wasn't he triaged properly? He didn't complain. Marcus said simply. Patterson opened his mouth, then closed it. He moved to the monitor, scanning the readouts. His expression shifted from anger to concern to something else. Recognition. "Wait," Patterson said slowly. "What's his name?" "Walter Green." Patterson went completely still. He turned to look at the man on the gurney, at the scar visible across his exposed chest. His face went pale. "Oh my God," he whispered. Marcus frowned. "You know him?" Patterson didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone with shaking hands. He dialed a number. Waited. When someone answered, his voice was tight, urgent. "This is Dr. Raymond Patterson at St. Catherine's Memorial. I need you to contact the Department of Defense. We have a situation. Patient name, Walter Green. Service number." He glanced at the old man's dog tags, barely visible beneath the medical equipment. 2479568. "Yes, that Walter Green. He's in cardiac arrest. We need authorization to use every resource available. I don't care what it costs. Do you understand? Every resource." He hung up, looked at Marcus. "Do whatever it takes to keep him alive," Patterson said, his voice shaking. "That man saved my daughter's life." Marcus stared at him. "What?" "My daughter, Emily. She was 6 years old. March 1971. Her school in Saigon. A bomb threat. They couldn't evacuate. A field medic crawled under the building and disarmed it with his bare hands. That medic," he pointed at Walter, "was him." The trauma bay went silent except for the steady beep of the monitors. Marcus looked down at Walter Green, at this small, frail man who had sat in a waiting room for 3 hours because he thought other people's emergencies were more important than his own. This man who had once spent 4 hours in a pitch-black crawl space, dismantling death so that 300 children could go home to their families. "Prep him for emergency catheterization," Marcus said, his voice steady now. "Certain." And someone called the board. "I want every cardiologist in this hospital on standby. We're not losing him." The surgery took 6 hours to in that time. Something extraordinary happened. Word spread. It started with a phone call from the Department of Defense to the hospital administrator, then a call from the VA, then from the Pentagon itself. Within 2 hours, 3 retired generals, 12 former field medics, and 47 veterans had arrived at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital. They filled the waiting room. They lined the hallways. They stood in silent vigil, these men and women who had served, who had fought, who had survived. They didn't know Walter Green personally. Most of them had never heard his name, but they knew what he'd done. They knew that in 1971, a field medic with no training in explosives had saved 317 lives. They knew that the same medic had spent the next 50 years in silence, never seeking recognition, never asking for anything in return. And they knew that tonight he needed them. Dr. Patterson led the surgical team. His hands, which had repaired thousands of hearts over 3 decades, had never moved with such care. Every stitch, every bypass, every delicate movement was performed with the precision of a man who understood what was at stake. This wasn't just a heart he was repairing. This was a debt being repaid. At 3:47 a.m., Walter Green's heart, weakened by age and damaged by time, began to beat on its own again. Strong, steady, alive. Dr. Patterson stepped back from the table, pulled off his mask, and allowed himself one moment of relief before returning to work. Walter woke 3 days later. The first thing he saw was sunlight. It streamed through the window of a private room, warm and golden. The second thing he saw was his daughter, Rebecca, asleep in a chair beside his bed, her hand resting on his. Rebecca. His voice came out as a croak. She jerked awake, her eyes red from crying. When she saw him looking at her, she burst into tears all over again. "Dad! Oh God, Dad! I'm okay," he whispered. "I'm okay." "You almost died," she sobbed. "You sat in that waiting room for 3 hours. You almost died because you didn't want to bother anyone. I'm sorry. Don't you ever do that again. Do you hear me? Don't you ever—" The door opened. Dr. Chin walked in, followed by Dr. Patterson. Behind them, in the hallway, Walter could see faces. Dozens of them, men and women in uniform. Veterans. Strangers. "Mr. Green," Dr. Chun said softly. "How are you feeling?" Confused, Walter admitted. What's going on?" Dr. Patterson stepped forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. He handed it to Walter. The IT was old, faded. A little girl with pigtails, smiling at the camera, holding a stuffed rabbit. "Her name is Emily," Patterson said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's my daughter. In 1971, she was 6 years old. She went to the international school in Saigon. And on March 17th, a man with no bomb training spent 4 hours under a classroom, disarming a device that should have killed everyone in that building." Walter stared at the photograph. His hands trembled. "She's 43 now," Patterson continued. "She's a teacher. She has 2 children. She's alive because of you." Tears ran down Walter's weathered cheeks. "You saved my daughter," Patterson said. "You saved 316 other children. And last Saturday, you almost died in our waiting room because you were too humble to ask for help." He paused. "We failed you, Mr. Green, but we're not going to fail you again." Dr. Chin stepped forward. "The hospital has issued a formal apology. Our triage protocols are being completely overhauled. And there's something else." He opened the door wider. The hallway was packed. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, filling every available space. When they saw Walter looking at them, they stood at attention. As one, they saluted. Walter tried to speak. Couldn't. He just stared at them. This army of strangers who had come because they'd heard his story, because they understood that the young man in a Marine uniform stepped into the room. He couldn't have been older than 25. He approached Walter's bed and snapped a perfect salute. "Sir," he said, his voice strong, "my grandmother was in that school. Because of you, she lived. Because of her, my mother was born. Because of my mother, I'm here. I just wanted to say thank you." He held the salute until Walter, with shaking hands, returned it point one by one. They came. Veterans, children of the children he'd saved, grandchildren, people whose lives existed because Walter Green had crawled into the darkness and refused to give up. That'd be why the time the sun set that evening, Walter had shaken 183 hands. He'd heard 183 stories. And for the first time in 50 years, he understood something he never allowed himself to believe. He mattered. 3 months later, Walter Green stood in his backyard, pruning roses. His chest was still tender, the scar from the surgery joining the old one like chapters in a book. His daughter visited every Sunday now. His grandchildren, who he barely knew before, called him twice a week. The hospital had named a wing after him, the Walter Green Emergency Care Center, a place where no one would ever wait alone again. And on his mantle, in a simple frame, sat a medal he'd never been awarded in 1971. The Secretary of Defense had delivered it personally, the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military honor, not for what he'd done 50 years ago, but for what he'd taught them all. That heroism isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. Sometimes it sits quietly in chair 47, waiting its turn, believing that everyone else's pain matters more than its own. And sometimes the world needs to be reminded that those quiet heroes deserve to be seen.